Think about the first movie you saw or book you read that took you on a journey into another world, changed your perspective on life or the human condition, or moved you to tears. What was it about that story that was so powerful? Why aren't there more stories out there that touch us so deeply? And is that secret sauce, which makes our favorite stories so epic, something we can decode and reproduce more reliably? These are the questions that I started asking myself when I was writing my first novel last year. The book I'm working on is a sci-fi fantasy trilogy based in Silicon Valley 100 years in the future. And it's something that I've been dreaming about writing for years. But I'm not an author by training. I'm a tech entrepreneur, and my experience is in developing consumer mobile applications. So I was previously chief product officer at Smule, a company that has developed music creation apps that have reached over 150 million people around the world. And we were able to reach this sort of scale with these artistic products by using lean startup processes and methodologies to continually improve these products over many years. And so it was only natural that as I was writing a novel, I began to wonder, can you apply lean startup to storytelling? And I soon discovered that you can. We tend to think of storytelling as a fundamentally intuitive art form. It's the product of creative genius and moments of inspiration. And you might ask, does data really have any place in such creative endeavors? But what I want to show you today is that creating a great story is really a lot like developing a great tech product. It happens through a process of continuous iteration, and it can benefit greatly from the use of data. There's also good reason to incorporate lean startup philosophies into story development, because if you do manage to create a great story, it can literally be worth $1 billion or more. Hollywood is a massive multi-billion-dollar industry, and when their products succeed, they're hugely profitable. But for every billion-dollar blockbuster, there are many, many more flops. And Hollywood is increasingly finding itself in a state of crisis. And the reason for this is that to produce a blockbuster requires a significant capital investment up front, often of $100 million or more. But Hollywood executives don't really have a reliable way of identifying scripts with hit potential at the outset. And they also don't have a good way of getting audience feedback during the creative process. To see how this plays out in real life, let's look at a movie that was released earlier this year called Jupiter Ascending. This was a highly anticipated sci-fi film written, directed, and produced by the Wachowskis, who were the creators of The Matrix. They had a nearly infinite budget at their disposal for production and marketing, and the key elements of the story, at the face of it, seem to have the makings of a sci-fi classic. So how did it do? Well, it was basically a complete flop at the box office. It lost a ton of money, and it was slammed by critics. And I think rightly so. If you watch the movie, the majority of you would agree that they basically got the most important parts of a story, namely the characters, the plot, and the world, completely wrong. And as I was watching this movie, I kept asking myself, how could something like this happen? How could such celebrated artists that have previously created a movie that had a huge impact on me and my youth, screw this up so badly? But if you take a step back and look at the process through which blockbuster films and flops are produced, it's actually not that surprising. In the tech world, it would be the equivalent of a previously successful entrepreneur going out and raising hundreds of millions of dollars for a crazy idea based solely on her reputation, proceeding to hire hundreds of people in the course of a few months, writing a business plan, and then spending the next 2 years developing a product behind closed doors based on that static business plan. And then at the end of it, basically betting it all on a single launch weekend. The process is designed for failure. But what's the solution? You can't really A/B test a movie, so how can Hollywood increase its hit rate? Well, the market is starting to show a path. If you look back at that list of billion-dollar movies that I showed you earlier, and take a look at the top 50 grossing movies of all time, you'll notice that over half of these movies are based on successful books, and this trend is increasing. So the market is starting to show a way to validate stories with hit potential before pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into production. And this is meaningful for a couple of reasons. The first is that books are obviously much cheaper to produce than movies are. And the second is that books or stories created in written word lend themselves much more naturally to lean startup. The most salient example of this in recent times is The Martian. So The Martian was written by an author, first-time author. He's actually a software engineer, Andy Weir, who's based here in Silicon Valley. And he released The Martian initially as he was writing it, one chapter at a time, on his personal blog. And as he began to release these chapters, he gained a small following of early adopters for his work. And these early readers began to give him feedback in the comments. And he started to incorporate the feedback that he was getting into subsequent revisions of his chapters. And as he released it chapter at a time, his readership grew. And by the time he released his last chapter, his readers were clamoring for him to release The Martian as a complete novel. So he self-published on Kindle, released it at 99 cents, and it shot to the top of the bestsellers, Amazon bestsellers list. And the rest is basically history. The Martian is on track to become one of the most successful sci-fi films of all time. So this is, for me, a very inspiring example of how you can start to use and incorporate lean startup philosophies into blockbuster story development with really the most basic of tools. But there was still something missing from The Martian. And this is a question that I really became obsessed with answering. Can you use actual analytics to understand reader behavior and to really know when your story is resonating with your audience? So I started my company, Telepathic, to answer this question and to see if we can use data to develop great stories more reliably. The first thing that my team and I wanted to understand was, can we use data to tell the difference between a good story and a bad story? So how did we test this? We took 50 best-selling novels from the young adult space, and we tested an excerpt of the first 1,000 words of these novels, so about a 5-minute excerpt of each of these. We put them up on a mobile-optimized website and put analytics into this website so we could track reader behavior. And we recruited readers from Facebook to these stories. We got about 300 people through each of these stories, so 15,000 readers in total. And we just kind of tracked what they did. And we were looking at several different things, but the thing that we were most interested in seeing was, what was the completion rate? What percentage of people made it through to the end of this 5-minute excerpt? And the thing that we really wanted to know was that, was there a difference in the quality of these stories or the level of engagement of these stories, even amongst bestsellers? Or was it just that, on average, about the same percentage of people would get through to the end of a 5-minute excerpt of these? And what we saw was that, sure enough, there are huge differences in completion rates between the best stories, even amongst bestsellers. So there was one interesting pattern that came out as we were testing these stories. It turned out that there seemed to be kind of a natural ceiling of a completion rate. In the best case, the best stories would have a 35% completion rate. We couldn't find anything in which more than 35% of people would get through the end of a 5-minute excerpt. And we began to ask ourselves, is there some sort of format innovation that we can come up with that would make stories more engaging on mobile? And so we had a hypothesis. Our hypothesis was that the reason that the completion rates aren't higher is that reading fiction is kind of a crappy experience on mobile. it's a wall of text, it's easy to lose your place, and the narratives are so long, they're not really designed for short session lengths. And so we wanted to come up with a new format for storytelling on mobile that made reading a better experience. We started with, so we iterated, we tested several different formats, and we started first with image-driven things. So we added illustrations to the books. We tried more of a comic book style where we reduced the amount of text on the screen and told more of the story through images, but nothing that we did really moved the needle. The completion rates didn't get worse, but they also didn't get better. Then we had the idea to tell a story in the form of a text message conversation between the characters. And to give you an example of this, I have a little excerpt, a 30-second excerpt of one of the stories that we tested. It's a story called Kidnapped, and it's a conversation that happens between two friends, Ella and Jacob. Let's see if it'll play. All right, looks like it's not going to play, but you can check it out. The app that we released a couple of months ago is called Hooked, and there are several of these stories in the app. And the first story that we tested had an 85% completion rate. So in this one test, this one format innovation, our completion rate suddenly jumped from 35% to 85%. Obviously, the first test that we ran, we thought it was an error. It didn't make sense that we could have such a huge impact on the completion through this format change. We tested it again, and we were able to replicate the results. And the next thing that we wanted to figure out was this extensible? Was this just some sort of fluke or novelty that this story was so effective in this form, or is this something that other authors could adopt to tell stories more effectively on the mobile device? So we started to reach out to top MFA programs across the country, put out a call that said paid opportunity in creative writing, and we got a ton of inbound interest. And in the first month, we had over 200 stories submitted to us, and we tested these stories. And over half of them had completion rates that ranged from 65% to 85%. So that was when we knew that we had something. We launched our app Hooked 2 months ago. We have over 600 stories now in the app, and 150,000 readers, young readers, have downloaded the app and read 1 million stories in that amount of time. So it's beginning to show us that you can, in fact, use Lean Startup to think about storytelling differently and to really start to tell stories that have more of an impact on the intended audience. I want to give you one last example of how we have begun to use the data from our stories in Hooked to give authors a tool in editing to help make their stories better over time. So one of our authors submitted a sci-fi story to us called Discovery. It was about a guy who goes on a solo space mission to another planet and sends messages back to his wife while he encounters an intelligent alien race. It was a cool story, I really liked it, but when we tested it, it had only a 39% completion rate. And this was now, for this new format, much below our threshold for our acceptance rate. We only accept stories that test at 65% completion or above. So I was kind of bummed to see this result. And I went back and looked at the survival curve of the engagement on this. And I noticed that there was an unusually steep drop-off towards the beginning of the story. So we were losing the majority of our readers in the first 20 messages. So I went back and read the story, and I noticed that the beginning of the story was kind of confusing. It was difficult to understand the context. Who were these characters? What was their relationship to each other, and what were they doing? So I just went in and I edited the story with this survival curve in mind, just for clarity. I just tried to make the first 20 messages clearer. And we A/B tested my revision against the original, and the revision now tested at an 80% completion rate. So this was really encouraging to us because it started to prove to us that you really can use Lean Startup to tell better stories. And my hope is, with our platform, Hooked, that we will eventually get to a place where anyone can come on any day of the week and read a story that moves them to tears. I want to just close with a discussion about this question, which is a question that I get asked a lot. Does data kill creativity? And if we had more time, I would love to get into a deeper philosophical discussion about this. But I'll just leave you today with a historical example. So, storytelling was originally an oral tradition. Storytellers would go from village to village and recount their tale to a live audience. And as they were telling their story, they were getting real-time data about how well their story was resonating with their audience. At what point in the story did people laugh or cry? When were they captivated and when were they bored? And the storyteller would incorporate this feedback, this data, into his story and make it better when he retold it at the next village. And I would argue that the reason that those ancient epics have endured through so many years is precisely because they've gone through so many iterations. So to me, I think if you look at the human experience objectively, it's clear that data doesn't kill creativity. Data frees us to risk being more imaginative, and it frees us to be more creative. So, thank you for your time.